Seeds of Yesterday by VC Andrews, the final book in her Dollanganger series, aside from, of course, the prequel, which maybe we'll get to sometime in the future. Chronologically, though, this is the last book, and although it's a while since I've read it, I still have some thoughts that I want to share, because I do ultimately think that this book is slightly unnecessary and slightly ridiculous, although to some extent I did still find it entertaining in the way that VC Andrews is always entertaining, even when she's not at her best. So let's get into it. Part 1, Summary. Taking place 15 years after the events of If There Be Thorns, Seeds of Yesterday finds Kathy and Chris visiting their son, Bart, at his new home, which is an exact replica of Foxworth Hall, the home that Kathy and Chris were imprisoned in all those years ago. They are there to celebrate Bart's 25th birthday. Also present are Bart's brother, Jory, and Corin's brother, Joel, who the family believed to have died in an avalanche years ago. Things within the family are far from peaceful. Bart, still resentful of his parents' incestuous love and the fact that Chris is the guardian of his Foxworth inheritance until he is 30, is determined to make their stay with him a living hell. He also resents his brother, Jory, who is now a successful dancer, along with his sister, Cindy, now a coquettish 16-year-old. In the background, Bart's resentment is further fueled by the zealotry of his uncle Joel. Part 2, Deja Vu. One thing that I noticed as I was reading this book was just a sense of deja vu constantly. I was thinking to myself, haven't I read this before? Because many of the plot points are just repeats of what was done, especially in the previous novel, If There Be Thorns. Again, we have Bart being a moody, aggressive, horrible brat without any of the charm this time, and he's obsessed and upset about his mother and father's incestuous relationship. And of course we have him being driven again by this religious zealot, now in the form of Joel, but in the previous book it was the butler, John Amos. So it's a very similar setup in this book, and for that reason I was thinking to myself, is this book really all that necessary? We also have the continued sibling rivalries as well, of course, mostly between Bart and Jory, but also with Cindy as well now. And again, it's just dialed up to 11 in this book, to a point where I can't really take it seriously, as much as you can take anything seriously in a VC Andrews book. To be fair, there is some originality in this plot, because now that they're all adults, we can get a little bit more sex in the stories, especially between the two brothers. There's lots of affairs and sleeping around going on, which is hilarious because Bart kind of frames himself in this novel as someone who is above sex, who's better than that, and he often uses this to chastise Cindy, who is, coming into her sexual life as well. And despite this, he is constantly doing stuff behind people's backs, which, to be fair, Cindy does point this out to him at one point, but I did find that quite a ridiculous part of his character. And ultimately, I just found most of this stuff a little bit too over the top to take seriously. The ending of the book as well is also somewhat recycled from the main story. I will talk about this in more depth. There are spoilers in this video, so if you don't want to know that, please stop watching now. But Chris dies at the end of this story in a way that's very similar to his father's death. And while Andrews does point this out, it doesn't really work, and it just feels again like a recycled plot point. Even the location in this book is a recycle, right? Because we're back at Foxworth Hall. Now it's a replica because it burnt down in a previous book. So again, it's just this sense of just things repeating themselves. And while that can be done in an artful way, I just don't think it was done in an artful way in this book. Think of something like Wuthering Heights, which has this theme of intergenerational abuse, perhaps, or at least the ways that past generations, the crimes that they commit, repeat themselves on the younger ones. And there's some repetition there, characters' names, for example, it can get quite confusing, but there's also original stuff going on, there's differences. Whereas with this book, it just feels like Andrews is literally just copy-pasting plot lines from one time to another, and so it doesn't have that feel of intergenerational cycles in the way that it would in a book where that actually works very effectively. It just feels like recycled stuff. And so for these reasons, I just found the book not very entertaining. I knew basically where certain plot points were going to go, just because you've seen the writing on the wall from previous books, and so there just wasn't as much keeping me hooked on this book. It was a matter of, we've been there, we've done that, can we do something else, please? Ultimately, I'm just not really sure why this book exists. I think that with the other books, even though I do think actually as a series, the Dollanganger series is just bizarre, because I think Flowers in the Attic, despite the cliffhanger ending, actually is a very good standalone book whereas the other ones do all seem a little bit like, are we just telling stories for the sake of it? And that's definitely true of Seeds of Yesterday. You could make a good argument for the other two books, just because they do actually deal with something concrete. With the Petals on the Wind book, we get the resolution of the storyline with the mother and the revenge on the grandma. We get in If There Be Thorns, we get this intergenerational theme when it's original and fresh. With Seeds of Yesterday, we're just, getting the dregs of stuff that's already happened. And so for that reason, I just don't think this book is needed. Part 3. Bart is infuriating. So although he was quite disturbed already in If There Be Thorns, there was something a bit charming about the character of Bart. Maybe it's because he was a kid, and so you can look past some of the more psychopathic moments and the creepy moments, and you can sort of see that he comes from this ridiculous family. And in some ways, he was actually quite witty at seeing things for what they were, and you could sort of enjoy his insanity a little bit. Whereas in this book, I think he went too far off the deep end to a point where he was completely unsympathetic, and I just hated him the entire way. And I also just couldn't understand why anyone was even willing to stay with him in this house. I would have just left immediately if I was Tret in the way that he treats his family. What's also frustrating about this is that Bart had more or less gone through all of this character development in the previous book. The things that drive him are the same. All that character development from the previous book just dialed right back because we're back to where we were. He's just a horrible person again. And so I found that frustrating as a reader, because it makes the development of the previous book almost worthless if we've not actually gone anywhere new. And in fact, we've just gotten incredibly worse. And so one has to wonder what exactly has happened in the intervening years to turn Bart into this monstrosity of a human being that he is, and why haven't his family just completely disowned him by this point? Fair enough when the brat is a child and a teenager and you have to look after them, but the minute they're 18, you get rid of them. Like, that's just a horrible person. And that might sound cruel, but if you read the book and you see just how far down the rabbit hole Bart has become as a person, it's completely ridiculous why anyone would want to entertain this nonsense. If the kid's moved out and he's rich and successful, let him be rich and successful, leave him alone, because he's just toxic to the core. So I just can't, I can't buy him as a character. A bit over the top, a bit ridiculous. Why are any of these family members staying with him at all? It's just too much. But of course, we do actually get a redemption for Bart at the end of the book, and it is a ridiculous redemption. So what happens is that Chris, who is basically, he's the man behind Bart's hatred for the most part. He blames Chris for everything. Chris is standing in the way of his fortune. Chris is the brother of his mother. All of this stuff. So he really blames Chris for all of his woes. Which, given how rich he sort of is, it's kind of weird that he really needs to hate Chris that much. But whatever. Anyway, and Chris dies at the end of the story in a car crash, like his dad, completely randomly, and this act is enough for Bart to suddenly realise what a wonderful man Chris was. I think he gives a very nice funeral speech. He just becomes a nice evangelist after that, has a good relationship with his siblings, and everything's fine. And this is just completely implausible, given the monstrosity that we've had to deal with for the past 200 300 pages or however that this would happen. It's ridiculous. And also it's just a very cheap way of doing character development, because there's no real reason why Bart would suddenly have this change of heart. Yes, sometimes that does happen in real life. A person dies randomly and maybe you didn't have the greatest relationship with them and it makes you think about them and value them. I just don't see that happening with someone like Bart, who's gone as far off the wagon as he has. Also, in a novel, we want something that's narratively satisfying. And so what you really need there is for Bart to have had some role in Chris's death. Not necessarily that he murdered Chris or anything, but, due to his reckless actions, Chris did something stupid and then he died. And then that would make more sense. If someone is implicated in the death of someone, even someone that they hate, it can really make them then look into themselves and think about things. Whereas if someone just randomly dies, that's just life. That's just a thing that happens. It's not obvious that it's going to trigger that kind of deep introspection. So I just didn't buy that. I found the death incredibly contrived. And yes, Andrews does try to, use this idea of it was like a mystical power that did this because Chris died in the way that his dad died. Didn't really do it for me. Wasn't that interesting. And I just did not buy Bart's transformation into decent human being at the end of the story believable in the slightest. Ultimately, Bart is just a very unlikable character in this book, and his redemption is just cheap and very inconsistently written. Part 4. Jory and Melody. Although, again, it does involve some ridiculous melodrama, which, I'm not above that because I'm reading VC Andrews books and some of them I enjoy. The story of Jory in this book was one that I actually quite enjoyed. So he is now married to his high school sweetheart, Melody. They were dancers together for a time. And in this book, Jory's dancing career is tragically taken away from him because he does a dance with Melody. There's an accident. It's implied maybe that Bart did this, or maybe Joel did this. I can't remember if we find out. But in any case, the accident leaves Jory with his back broken and he's paralyzed, and so he can never dance again. Melody is also pregnant, and after all of this tragedy, she gives birth, decides that she doesn't want to be the wife of a cripple looking after two squalling brats, and so she has an affair with Bart, and then that doesn't go well because Bart's a psycho, and so when she realizes that he's a psycho, she just runs away, abandons her kids and her paralyzed husband, and that's the end of her. And that is the kind of ridiculous melodrama bit of this story. But then we get a quite interesting and subtle portrayal, well, I don't know if subtle's quite the right word, but a decent portrayal of Jory as he is, growing accustomed to life as someone who can't walk. And obviously his career was one that depended upon him being able to not just walk, but be hyper athletic, flexible, and everything. And so now he has to come to terms knowing that he can never do that again. And I actually thought that was one of the better parts of the story. It was original to this story, although Andrews has played with disability as a theme throughout her work. It still felt like an original part of this story. I thought it was really well done, and I quite liked Jory as a character. He was a bit bland in If There Be Thorns. He has a bit of darkness in this, and he comes out on the other side reasonably well. So I thought that was a really good aspect to the story, and one that I enjoyed. Part 5. Cathy, the Ending, and the Gothic. I actually don't remember Cathy all that much from this book. Mostly she's reacting to her ridiculous son and refusing to leave the house that he's living in. Don't know why, but she is. And aside from that, I don't remember her presence all that much. The story is more from her perspective again, but it still very much is focused on Bart and the ridiculous things that he does. But one thing that does stand out to me is the end of the novel, which it comes about with Cathy's own demise. So she's lost Chris. Everything now is wonderful with the family for some random reason. And Cathy, I think, she decides to stay in the house while everyone else, I think they go out or something. She goes up to the attic where obviously she was as a child with the others, except she wasn't because this is a replica, not the original house. So it would have had more pathos if it was the original house, if we hadn't have burnt it down. But of course we had to burn it down because melodrama and ridiculousness, right? So she goes back up to the attic, and in a sort of poetic scene, she sort of makes the room up to look like it did when they were kids. She sits down and she dies, presumably of a broken heart. Now this, to me, harkens back to the more gothic fairy tale themes of the original book. And one of the reasons why I actually quite like Flowers in the Attic is that it does have this dark whimsy to it that cuts through the melodrama, cuts through the bizarre prose, and makes it this original thing that I think is actually worth reading even nowadays. That's something that gets lost with the books that follow. There are little moments here and there of that, but mostly it's kind of just too ridiculous for that. And most of Seeds of Yesterday is like that. But with this final moment, we sort of harken back to that style, and I do enjoy it, but I think, again, it just comes across as a little bit silly, because at the end of the day, this story is set in the real world. It's not a supernatural story, and this idea of someone going up to the attic and dying of a broken heart does seem a little bit silly to me. I think maybe it could have been done a little bit better. Even just having Cathy go back to the attic and looking around and remembering and ending the story there, I think would have been fine. You could have even had her kill herself, and that would have been fine. That would have harkened back to her sister's death, because she also killed herself. Maybe that would have been fine. I just felt like the idea of dying with a broken heart was a little bit silly. Although as a set piece, as an original thing that happened, I do still enjoy that scene. And if you just buy into the whimsy and the craziness of the series, then I think ultimately it is a good ending for that. I just think it could have been a little bit better done as well. Part 6, Conclusion. I read the whole Dollanganger series pretty much in very quick succession. I was in between, my previous job was coming to an end, I was moving house, It was just keeping me going. And by this point, I was getting fatigued. Now, it may have been readers' fatigue just generally, but I think it was also just to do with this novel specifically, because I don't necessarily mind the melodrama of the previous books. I think it can be silly, but it's sort of enjoyable silly. Whereas with this one, I just felt that the repetition was too much, and it just made this book feel very unnecessary. It was nice to have an ending to the series that felt final, in the sense that we have Kathy and Chris dying, so all of the original children and family are now dead. Nevertheless, I feel like while that's sort of nice in a, that's a very final way to kill people sort of way, If There Be Thorns also had a pretty good ending. And in a way, it made for a better conclusion to the series, because what you actually had in that book was the introduction of the new generation and their craziness, that being resolved, but you also had the plot with Kathy's mother finally being resolved properly as well with her death. And so actually that book just felt like a nice, here's where we end it, let's have a nice trilogy, lovely. But instead we wrote this book. I feel like Andrews didn't know what to do with it, so she just recycled a lot of stuff. That's how it felt to me anyway. And so for that reason, this book just felt quite redundant. The melodrama was too much, if that's possible. I felt that Bart was not believable in this book in the way that he was in the previous one. I could understand why he felt like a black sheep in the previous book, because he was. I could understand why he would react in the way that he does in the previous book, finding out all of these crazy things about your family. It's going to be pretty horrifying. But it seemed like those things were dealt with, so why are they being repeated here? There was a nice subplot with Jory and Melody, a little bit melodramatic. Nevertheless, still quite good. I liked that storyline, and I felt like it was well done to see Jory go from someone who is, he's the golden boy of the family, idolized, perfect, has this accident, loses his will to live, tries to find new hobbies, love of his children, love of a new woman. All that stuff was really well done. So for that, I enjoyed the book a lot. Overall, I do enjoy the Dollanganger series still. There was just something about VC Andrews' bizarre writing choices. She's not a great writer, but she's an interesting writer, and for me, that is usually more important. Not always more important. You still have to have some degree of talent, and I think that she does. But, you also have to have something that makes you interesting, and I think that she certainly does have that. I might review the prequel book, because actually it was a book that I didn't expect to enjoy. I think that narratively it's bizarre and kind of irritating, but actually as a sort of novel on its own, I quite liked it. So maybe we'll get to that sometime in the future. Who knows when. Let me know down in the comments though, what did you think of Seeds of Yesterday, if you've read it, or if you read it all those years ago and it was published? Let me know what you think of the Dollanganger series as a whole. Do you think that, with me, I think my view is that the first book is great, probably should have stopped there. The second two books are okay in various ways, and this one is just to the point. What do you think about the series? Let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra!